So I'm just going to jump into the talk really quickly. Just as a quick check, where is everyone from? North? Okay, South? Whoa, okay. So was mostly all from Bangalore? Okay, East? Okay, so I guess the representation in the East is a bit less. What about West? Oh wow, okay. So I guess we need to look at the diversity and hopefully increase this the next time around. So anyway, when I found out about the summer school, I was pretty excited about it. I was thinking about what would be a good topic to talk to you guys about. And I pulled out some stuff that I'd done with a couple of people. This was about 2 years back. And just as a little bit of inspiration, the guys out here, Prakriti Agarwal, Yashodhan Karandikar, no relation to me, I'm Srirang Karandikar, I'm the one at the bottom out there. So these guys have just graduated from college, right? They've done their undergrad in, I think, IT and computer engineering, and they joined my company and they were looking for interesting projects to do. And I'd recently read a very interesting paper whose reference I'll give you at the end. And I said, why don't we try some of the ideas listed out here? So we did this, and I think it's really nice because it brings up a lot of ideas. Quicksort is something that I'm assuming all of you guys know. Yes? Okay, good. We can use that as an excuse to talk about a whole bunch of things about computer science in general, right? So these guys did all the work. I'm just doing the talking out here. So if you have any, major questions, or if you have ideas about what other things you can do, get in touch with me. This is a great field, and there's lots of interesting stuff we can do. One issue I've always had with a lot of stuff that I see students work on is that people tend to be very focused upon learning, computer languages, learning the syntax. And I keep trying to tell students that that's not really worth much, right? I mean, you can learn the syntax, you can learn different APIs, but you're not really going to become a good computer scientist, right? So what else is involved in being a good computer scientist? And I'd like to make this interactive, but given that I've been unforgivably late, I'm just going to jump through this. One is the programs that you write don't run in a vacuum. They run on a particular platform, and it's really important to understand what that platform is and how it's actually executing your program. The computer itself doesn't understand for I equal to 0, I less than n, I plus plus. It understands bits and opcodes, right? So sure, but we are still writing our code in a high-level language, and there's this compiler that's going to go in and convert that high-level language into the actual opcodes. And you'd be surprised at the kinds of transformations that take place. A lot of times, what we actually write and what gets executed can be a huge difference, and you really need to understand what's going on out there. And then, of course, your computer is not really running by running just your program. There's this operating system that's sitting in between your program and the actual hardware that's taking care about a lot of stuff, and that can impact how your program runs as well, right? So, okay, so this stuff is, it's pretty okay. It's commonsensical. The interesting thing is when we start getting into a little bit of more detail. So, for example, algorithms are crucial, and which is why we're talking about one of the most fundamental algorithms right now. I work in an area called high performance computing, and this is something that, if you can take something that takes n squared time and make it run in n log n or n log log n, that's a huge benefit. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. Algorithms and data structures are crucial. It doesn't matter whether after you graduate, you take up a career working in something like, writing shopping carts for Flipkart or something like that. Algorithms are key. Right? It doesn't matter what area you're working on. A very underrated aspect of computer science is design. Right? Are you guys familiar with object-oriented programming? Right? That's on the left-hand side. Object-oriented design is, okay, I think I got that right. So object-oriented design is on the right-hand side. But design in general, how you design your data structures it can lead to very elegant solutions. And if you can come up with really nice solutions, you're hitting the sweet spot. Has anybody heard of Fred Brooks? Yes? No? Okay, so he's one of the few ACM Turing Award winners. Have you guys heard of the Turing Awards? Okay. He got the award for he wrote this book called The Mythical Man Month. But he's also written recently a book called The Design of Design. And that's very meta, he's gone one level up. And he's actually thinking about what makes good design itself and how do you design that. So I highly recommend that to you guys if you're interested. So what's missing up there? The one key thing, anyone want to guess? What's the basis of all computer science, the foundations? The stuff that possibly you thought you were done with after your second year of engineering, right? All computer science is mathematics. All the software that you write, all the algorithms that you develop, all the analysis that you do, it's all mathematics, right? You get a good handle on all of the stuff over on this side, and that's when you become an expert, right? So I just wanted to throw this up to get you guys thinking about, don't just think about banging away and putting out a lot of code and learning all kinds of APIs. I've been, well, not really in computer science, but I've been doing this stuff for about 20 years now, and it seemed, every time something new comes up, it sounds like, wow, this is fantastic, but it lasts for a few years and then there's other new stuff that comes up. Right? I was working on Java when the language spec was still being designed, and now it's probably the most mundane thing out there. I don't know what the latest and greatest is, probably Python or something else, Ruby on Rails, I don't know. So if you get these basics right, that's what's important. You can always learn whatever new language comes up. Okay, so what's the whole point of me coming here? The title of the talk is Quicksort, and I'm coming and talking about all of this other things. Like I said before, Quicksort is just an excuse. I just want to use that as an example to talk about a whole bunch of other things. But since we are talking about Quicksort, I do hope that your fundamental understanding of this algorithm really improves by the end of this half an hour, right? There's a lot of things that you can work on when you're developing algorithms, when you're implementing them. And I'm hoping to use this talk to have you guys start thinking about things. Right? Did you guys implement Quicksort when you were studying them? How did you test it? Come on. I have the advantage of a mic, so. Oh, okay, anyone, just. Did you guys, yeah. Right, so give it a sample input and see if it's working, right? What was the size of the input that you gave it? Wow, fantastic. How did you test that? Visually? Okay. So, no, but that's great. I mean, normally when I've given this talk and I've asked, so what inputs did you use? It's been about 10 or 15, right? So it's great that you've actually tried it with larger inputs. I want to enforce that through this talk. There's a whole discipline about testing performance, testing correctness that I want to bring out. I'm not going to talk about it specifically, but I'm hoping when I show you all of these results, you'll be able to really start thinking about these things, right? So there's a lot of really fantastic stuff, really cool stuff you can do when you're implementing a program. And let's start with looking at some of those things using Quicksort. So I'm going to use a paper that was published in 1999. So that's 15 years back as a starting point. And remember what I said about mathematics being the basis of everything. You'll see an example. You'll see what I'm talking about when I show you a few of these examples. The top 10 algorithms of the 20th century, right? Before we get into what those top 10 algorithms are, where does the word algorithm come from? Anyone? Ah, fantastic. Okay, yes. But you stole my thunder. So, a lot of words in English are derived from Latin and Greek, and to some extent even from Sanskrit. And if you try to dig around a little bit, you can come up with possible explanations like pain and to feel cold. And if you talk to people who work on algorithms, that sounds plausible. But yes, that's not where the word comes from. It's according to Knuth. Have you guys heard of Knuth? Excellent. Al-Khwarizmi, Al-Kitab, Al-Muqtasar, Fi Hisab, Al-Jabr, Wal-Muqabla. I've probably screwed up the pronunciation, but I've highlighted a couple of words that you should be able to understand. Well, of course, Kitab as well. Al-Jabr, what is that the root of? Algebra, right? So this is kind of the book that took a lot of Indian mathematics and exposed it to the Western world. And really, the whole Arabic numerals and how you solve equations comes from this. So algorithms comes from the name of the author of the book, Al-Khwarizmi. What were these algorithms? Going back to what I said about mathematics being the root of computer science, This is a list of top 10 algorithms of the 20th century. Most of these have to do with mathematics, right? Not kinetic, Monte Carlo methods, the simplex methods, linear programming, Krylov subspace methods, right? And you know, you've probably heard of von Neumann, maybe Danzig, but Householder is a name well known to mathematicians, not necessarily to computer scientists, right? So anyway, but we are here to talk about Quicksort, and I really like the way they quoted this, right? In 1962, Tony Hoare presents Quicksort, right? And look at the way they've described it. Its elegant simplicity has made it the poster child for computational complexity. What a beautiful sentence, and it describes Quicksort so wonderfully well. Its elegant simplicity. I can describe Quicksort to you in 4 lines, right? I can describe it to my daughter and she won't understand it, but you know, I can describe it to her without any complicated stuff. Elegant simplicity, it's so easy to understand. Take a pivot, split up my array, greater than, less than, and then iterate on the sub-arrays till the arrays are small enough and there's nothing more to do. It's elegant simplicity. And you know, it's actually really easy to understand as well, even if the language seems a bit difficult. So if I plot array indices on the x-axis and the values on the y-axis, I pick a pivot, I partition, right? I move all numbers that are greater than to one side, less than to the other side, and then I repeat, and repeat, and repeat, and repeat, and repeat, and repeat, till my array is sorted. You know, if it's ascending or descending, doesn't really matter. Elegant simplicity. Doesn't get simpler than that, right? But its elegant simplicity has made it the poster child for computational complexity. What's the complexity of Quicksort? N log n, n squared, right? When is it one versus the other? Okay, okay, lots of buzzing around. So if it is sorted or if it has a certain pattern, there are certain conditions where you get pushed to n squared behavior. At other cases, you're at n log n behavior, right? What's the difference between n log n and n squared? It can be huge. If my n is small, right, my difference is 10k versus a million, which is bad but not too bad. And of course, if it's larger, and you can imagine getting data of 1 million elements, in today's big data world, 1 million is pretty small. What's the difference out there? The difference is 20 million to a trillion, right? Your running time can blow up fantastically if you don't do this well. Why is this a poster child of computational complexity? Many PhD theses have been written in trying to understand when we are in the n log n world and when we are going towards the n squared, and how to make sure that we spend more time with n log n than with n squared, right? So fantastic algorithm, very simple, very rich. There's a lot of stuff you can mine out there. And if you think about the standard implementation of Quicksort, do you guys know what that is? So if you're writing a program in C, there's a library function called qsort, right, which was implemented, I don't know, 30 or 40 years ago, and it's pretty much been static, right? Now, if we want to use Quicksort, the best, or any algorithm for that matter, the best thing is to use the best thing to do is to use an already implemented library function, because it's been tested like crazy, and you're very likely to get good performance out of it, right? So even when we were looking at this, we said, oh yeah, there's a standard library implementation, so we should just stick with that. But then we started saying, okay, let's dig a little bit deeper and see what's going on out there, right? So rather than just picking up, and it's open source in the sense you can just go in and look at it, right? So we went in out there and we said, okay, what are the places, what are the main points that we could potentially tweak? Given that people have been looking at this for the past few years, is there still scope for further improvement, right? And when we look at improvement, basically what we are talking about is performance, right? So what we wanted to do was try out a whole bunch of different things, see if the performance improves, all right? So when we're talking about performance, how do we measure performance? Okay, standard way, there are a few system calls, get time of day, clocks, times.h, time.h. What's the problem with these? They're too granular, right? they will give me measurements in the minimum that they can detect is milliseconds, right? And when you have a processor that's running at gigahertz, right, we're talking about 10 raised to 3, 10 raised to 6 clock ticks that have gone by that we can't even detect, right? So the alternative is to use something called RDTSC. This is an assembly language instruction implemented on Intel processors. I'm not sure about AMD processors. Stands for read timestamp counter. So the processor has a 64-bit register that increments every clock cycle, right? That's the best you can get. You can't measure anything smaller than that. Well, nothing's happening that's smaller than 1 clock tick as well in some cases, but let's skip that. Okay, what are we going to measure this on? Right? Is it enough just to take a single array, run quicksort and see whether it works or not? Probably not, right? So we came up with all possible variations that we could think of, right? Starting from different array sizes. So it's not just we want to test it on a large array, we want to test it on a range of sizes. We want to try it on a different set of data types. We want to try it on different patterns, which I'll talk about in the next few slides. At the time we did this, we had access to 4 different x86 platforms. I hope these names are familiar to you guys. These are the architecture code names that Intel uses. What you buy outside is, you know, Xeon E5365, I don't know what, but this is basically the microarchitecture that implements those designs. And there are subtle differences, or in some cases, really major differences between these microarchitectures. So, you know, if you take the combinations that are possible, we end up with something like 5,000 combinations. And it's not really enough to run a test once and count how much time it took. We've got to actually run it multiple times to make sure we are accounting for any variations, right? So for any change that we make in the implementation choices that we have, we ran, how much is it? 17,000 different tests to see what the impact of the change was, all right? We did quite a few changes, which I'm going to talk about, but don't worry, I'm not going to walk you through all 17,000 tests. I'm just going to give you the big picture. Okay, so what are these array patterns? This is what would be random. This is what we call a sawtooth. And there's something really interesting that came up because of this. This is call it a triangular waveform, right? A plateau and a constant, right? So these are typically patterns that we actually see in the code that we write that we're trying to sort, right? Okay, so okay, elegant simplicity, right? Few lines of quicksort, few lines of pseudocode describing the entire algorithm. What are the knobs that we can use to tweak it? So very quickly, the first is the decision point about when the array size is too small. And typically, and this is a very standard technique, if the array size is smaller than a certain number, we can actually use insertion sort. What's the complexity of insertion sort? N squared, right? The constant is pretty low though. So for smaller array sizes, insertion sort is much more efficient than quicksort. The standard implementation takes 8 as a filter. So if your array size is less than 8, it's going to be sorted using insertion sort, otherwise it's going to be sorted using quicksort. Okay, how do we select the pivot? We've got a whole bunch of choices out there, and how does that impact the performance, right? How do we partition the array? I'm going to say something out there that's going to be very important to you guys considering you're in the 3rd year. And finally, you know, are there any optimizations we can apply at the point at which we actually do the recursion, right? So that's basically what I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so. When we, and okay, here's where RDTSC really helped us versus, you know, get time of day. When we take an 8-element array and sort it using insertion sort, takes about 600 clock cycles, right? Quicksort on the same array takes 2000 clock cycles. So sure, makes a lot of sense. If your array is less than 8, just use insertion sort. And this, by the way, is recursive, right? So you have a big array, you're partitioning. You come to a sub-array that is less than 8, or 8 or less than 8, and then you switch over to insertion sort. Okay, but then the other thing is this the right number? Is 8 the right number? It's clearly the right number out here, but should that barrier be shifted? Should it be different? Okay, so that's one thing that we tried. The other thing that I want to also mention is the whole aspect of doing a lot of pen and paper analysis and forecasting how much benefit you're going to get, right? So, for example, we took these numbers and said, okay, for 8, you know, it's going to be about 2.5 times faster, right? So if we assume that we have this big tree, and it's not true, but let's assume for the sake of argument that it's going to divide equally in the ideal case, right? We can actually count the number of leaves that we have, and therefore how much improvement we're going to get with 8. If we take a different number like 16 or 32 or 64, we can do the same thing. So do a lot of pen and paper analysis, estimate how much impact your change is going to have, and then implement it and measure it and verify whether that's actually the case or not. Okay, so what did we get? Out here I have an array size on a log scale, and on the y-axis, so this is going to be the standard way of presenting performance numbers for this talk. On the y-axis, I'm comparing two different things. So in this case, insertion sort versus quick sort, right? It's a ratio. And I am going to talk about it for a particular architecture, for a particular pattern, and for a particular data type. All right? So with that introduction, the one line out here is going to be the point above which insertion sort is better, below which quick sort is faster, right? And now here's a kind of a aha moment when we sweep across different array sizes, right? For a Clover Town, it turns out that instead of 8, the switchover, the crossover point is somewhere around 128. So if your array size is 128 or less, it is far better to be using insertion sort than quick sort, right? And for the past 30 years, we've got a standard library implementation that's stuck at 8. What have we left on the table? All of this stuff, right? Twice the performance, 2x the performance on straight sorting of arrays of those type. Okay, so great. So let's just go ahead and switch it to 128 statically for everything, right? Not so fast. If we take a Sandy Bridge processor, which is a current generation processor, right now Intel selling what they call Ivy Bridge and later on Haswell, this crossover point moves over to the, okay, from my perspective to the left, right? So does that mean every time we come up with a new processor, we should just shift that decision point over to the left? Probably not, because we tried this with an architecture, well, I'll talk about this in a second. We tried this with an architecture called Merom, which came after Clover Town but before Sandy Bridge, and that was even more to the left, right? So the basic point is, this is a situation where we need to dynamically figure out what the correct crossover point is. We can't just simply say, hey, this is what I'm going to take and that's what I'm going to stick with, right? The other interesting thing out here that I highlighted before are these peaks out here. Yeah, it's not a smooth curve. There are peaks out here, and out there, and this bears a lot of investigation. My suspicion is this has to do with the cache size of the processor that we're working with, but that's something that we need to investigate. Okay, so what's the impact of this? Let's say we implement this, and in a version of quick sort that we're going to call quicker sort. Okay, let me just talk about this. If my array size is increasing instead of it being a double, right? This is a very interesting chart. So if I have an increasing array size, my quick sort performance is going to be what? Big O of n squared, right? Do you guys agree? Okay. My insertion sort performance is going to be what? It doesn't matter, it's going to be n squared anyway, right? But guess what? Look at what this is telling you. How much faster is insertion sort over quick sort as you increase the array size, if the array is already sorted, right? That's where that constant is coming in, right? So if you're happy with big O notation, great, but in practical terms, you can't ignore the constants, right? Okay, so in the interest of time, let me skip all of this. How much better, okay, let me skip this. Okay, so if I implement this crossover point to be 128 to 256, how much faster is my quicker sort than the traditional quick sort, right? It's a bit difficult to tell out here because the y-axis is in terms of clock ticks. So if we change that to a ratio, this actually tells us something interesting. This is 1. So all of these points, we are always faster. For the last one with 5 million elements, we are slower. And I don't really believe that. I mean, that is something that we need to investigate. Okay. So yeah, this is what we did for insertion sort versus quick sort. The really important point to keep in mind out here is this. Do not make static assumptions. right? Just don't set it to 8 or 128 or 256 or what have you and say we're done. Every time you come up with a new platform, we've got to try it out and figure out what the right approach or what the right crossover point has to be. Okay. How do we select the pivot in Quicksort? What did you guys do? First, last, median, median of medians, right? Huge amount of work has gone into figuring out what the right pivot should be. So we just did a little bit of testing to see how it impacted performance. Once again, this is a ratio. So the baseline is we're taking the lower pivot, right? And then what happens? We take the first element of our subarray as the pivot. And then what happens if, in this case, I take a random element from the array and use that as a pivot, right? For a random array, input array, I would assume that it doesn't matter at all, right? The first element is just as random as a random element, right? But guess what happens? It's always worse, all the time. A random element is giving us lower performance than the first element. Any guesses why? Yes, you've got to calculate the random number to figure out which one. There's one more very crucial reason, right? Here's the thing, when you are taking the first element of an array, no, it's a random element, it's a random array, right? No. So you're taking the first element and then you're comparing all the other elements with respect to this. So if it's a random array, you're bound to get roughly the same partitions, or rather the partition behavior will be the same as taking a random element. Here's the thing, if you're taking the first element, most likely it's going to be in the cache, right? If you take a random element, of course you're spending cycles calculating which random index to use, and then of course doing all the math to make sure it's within the range that you're interested in. But if that element is not in the cache, you're incurring the cost of going out and pulling it in, right? That's where your knowledge of your microarchitecture and what's really happening at the machine level is really going to impact you. Okay, so if we take some others, last and middle, again they're worse. So now last and middle there is a little bit of calculation. Last there's no calculation. This is because of the cache, right? And the really weird thing is that spike that you see out here, right? For I think this is I don't know, like probably 64 or something. For array sizes of 64, the first is the worst one to take. We have no idea why, right? There's something funny with 64 going on, but hey, what the heck? I mean, it's interesting. It's worth investigating further. Okay, this is for a random array, right? Your array is random. Guess what happens if I use a plateau? It's okay, it's kind of okay, and then it gets a lot better. Not using the first element is actually better, right? Here's what happens when your array is decreasing, right? If we take the first element, that's what you said, you're always going to get 1 n minus 1, 1 n minus 1 every time you partition with the first element or with the last element. So in this case, a random is going to be much better, as is going to be taking the middle element, because if it's already sorted, you're getting n by 2, right? But if you're taking the first element or the last element, we get the n squared behavior, not the n log n behavior, right? Okay, so that's all I'm going to talk about. There's a lot of ideas that we had about selecting medians and medians of medians, and then trying to figure out how that interacted with the cache behavior of the platform that we were running on. So if you guys are interested, we can talk about that later on. Okay, here's the part that's going to be really useful to you guys, when you guys have companies coming in for campus interviews, all right? What we're doing out here is partitioning, doing a compare, and then swapping elements. That's how Quicksort is typically implemented. A typical interview question, how do you swap two variables? You define a variable temp, var temp is equal to var1, var1. Okay, you guys know how to do that. Okay, interview question number 2. How do you do this without a temp variable? Okay, multiple ways of doing it, right? You can use XORs, you can use addition and subtraction, right? The right answer to give out here, if somebody asks you in an interview, and by the way, if you don't get a job, don't blame me, okay? You tell them, okay, this is an idiotic question. I refuse to join a company that asks such stupid questions. All right? Why? Guess what's happening at the machine level? How is this going to be translated into assembly? You have registers in your CPU, right? So all you need to do is load variable 1 into register 1, variable 2 into register 2, store register 2 into variable 1 and store register 1 into variable 2. You don't need a temp variable. You don't need any of these fancy tricks anyway, right? This, by the way, is a really lousy thing to do because you could end up with overflows and wrong answers, but anyway. Okay, great, right? So you've lost your job. Sorry. But this only works if you use the right compiler flags. If you don't use the right compiler flags, it will actually instantiate a temp. It will actually copy data back and forth from memory, right? Anyway, that's a little bit of an aside that I just wanted to share with you. We did do not the load variable 1 into register 1 stuff. But if there is an array with comparison with equal elements, we figured out an optimization where we can skip those, right? And then our assumption was, okay, we are saving a lot of compares, and then there's a branch out there. A branch can be expensive because if it's not predicted correctly, your pipeline gets flushed, etc., etc., etc. But guess what happened? These guys are, okay, this is a bit difficult to see because it's in clock tick. So let's look at it in terms of comparisons, right? For small arrays, it actually slowed down the program, right? Any guesses why? It's a small array. It's a random array, right? Random doubles. So the likelihood of getting elements that are equal to each other, pretty small, right? So we go through all of this hoopla to save computation in a situation that happens extremely rarely. Okay, so you remember that sawtooth waveform that I talked about before, right? Here's what happens in a sawtooth waveform. So in this region, right, let's look at it like this. It's actually worse, and then it starts getting better. And you can understand this in the context of how we generated that sawtooth. So what we did was we said, okay, let's define, our sawtooth, the period of one cycle to be 100 elements or 10 elements, I forget what it is, or 8 elements, right? And then if my array size is 1024, I just replicate that as many times as needed, which means that in the sawtooth, I have equal elements, but I have more equal elements the bigger my array is. And therefore, the optimization where we are skipping equal elements gives us benefits for larger arrays, but the overhead is too much for smaller arrays. That again gives us a strategy to say that, okay, I am going to use this optimization depending on the type of the array and the size of the array. I've got to look at both of those, right? All right. Let's talk about tail recursion. Do you guys know what that is? Yes? Yes? How many people? Okay, a few yeses, a few nos. Okay. Tail recursion is essentially what? Not quite. Still not quite. Close, but not yet. Anyone else? Tail recursion? Still not quite. Okay, here's the thing, right? This is what compilers do. And remember what I said at the beginning, that what you think you're writing and what is actually executing can be completely different. All right? You guys have written Fibonacci, calculate the factorial of a number recursively, right? You can write that iteratively as well using a for loop. If your recursion is simple enough, your compiler will take a recursive implementation and convert that to an iterative one using a technique called tail recursion, right? And this is really powerful because it's really expensive to call a function. You've got to save the entire context, jump, start executing from a new point, save that context, jump back. It's expensive. Iteration is much more efficient from a performance perspective. Just imagine a compiler is smart enough to transform what you thought, oh, look at me, I'm so cool, I'm using recursion, into an iterative call, right? There's a catch though. It'll only do it if it can guarantee, the first rule of any compiler is correctness. If it can guarantee correctness, if it can guarantee that because of this change, my code is going to give me the same results as before, that's when it's going to do it. Otherwise, it's not going to do it, right? So what we did was, just to see what the benefit of this would be, we implemented, I call this a one-sided Fibonacci, because if you write Fibonacci really stupidly, you could end up with a really large tree. So, you know, on this log scale, it looks pretty good. There's a between 1.5 to 2.5x improvement when we are doing iteration over recursion, right? So great, now quicksort, if you look at the pseudo code, it's like, okay, do a bit of stuff and then just recurse, right? So why don't we hope, or why doesn't does the compiler implement this as an iteration? Answer, no, because it cannot guarantee correctness. It's a bit too complicated. You know, we're doing all of this twiddling around with indices. So it cannot figure out all the logic to say that it is safe to do iteration, to do tail recursion. So he said, yay, that's great, because that gives us an opportunity to do something that's going to improve the performance, right? What do we need to do to convert recursion to iteration? In the context of quicksort, we need to be able to maintain all the indices that we are iterating over. All right, so we went ahead and implemented it, and this is what we got. A bit of improvement at the high end and really lousy at the low end, right? So it's you know, I forget what the number is, but it's probably like 10 times slower, right? So again, whoa, okay, hang on a second. This is this fantastic operation. We've proved using a simple example that it can be 2.5 times faster if we do it enough. But look at this, we are actually getting it to be 5 times slower, 10 times slower. What the heck is going on, right? I'd ask you guys to guess, but the answer is actually related to the way we implemented this. So I'll just give it to you. So when we were doing this, one of the questions that we had was, we need to maintain an array that is going to tell us, that's going to store the indices of the iteration, right? And we need to store multiple of these indices, because, you know, we're going through all of these guys. There's a quote by I think it's by Knuth that goes, premature optimization is the root of all evil, right? So what we did was, what is the size of the array that we need to do, that we need to store? So we went back and we looked up volume 1 of the Art of Computer Programming, where Knuth comes up with this big calculation, and he says, okay, for an array size of n, if you want to calculate the size of the tree, then at the leaf level, these are the maximum number of leaves you're going to get. And it's not a simple calculation, right? It's got a logarithm or an exponential or something like that in there. So we said, great, now we know the size of the array that we need to use, given the input array size. So we went ahead, and in our implementation, we said, okay, if n is equal to blah, then we calculate this exponential and then this logarithm, and then we do a malloc where we use this array to store all of these indices for iteration. And guess what? If you're doing either a log or an exponential calculation on a x86 CPU, it's not like a multiplication or an addition. It doesn't happen in 1 cycle or 5 clock cycles or 20 clock cycles like a division does. It is an iterative algorithm that goes on and on for a few hundreds of clock cycles. Problem number 1, right? The second thing is, we're doing a malloc, which is really expensive, right? And that is what is giving us this behavior instead of this that we want. And even this is, you know, 16x, that's all. We were expecting a lot more, right? Okay, so here's the other part where the premature optimization is the root of all evil comes in. What were we trying to optimize for? We were trying to save, you know, we were trying to store as small a memory footprint for these array indices as possible, right? But guess what? What's log base 2 of 8? 3, right? 32, 1024, right? As n increases, log base 2 is growing really, really slowly. So what the heck? I don't care if I take the largest possible array size that I'm going to use, right? And assign an array of, I don't know, 1024, right? 1024 and the size of an int is 4 bytes, right? That's 4K. That's nothing, right? I can eat up 4K doing, you know, just loops with iterating over something, digits of pi, I guess. So what are we trying to optimize? Instead of 4K, we'd be using 8 bytes. Who cares, right? So we just got rid of that. We just used a static statically allocated array, no calculations about the sizes, and then implemented the iterative approach, right? Here's what we got. So the red line is our original iteration, the blue one is the recursion, the green one is the new iterative approach, right? And as you can see, this is always above 1, and then you can go all the way to, what is that, 23 times faster. All right, 23 times is huge. Okay, I'd be happy with 2 times. So, okay, so, this is just kind of a quick rush. I know I've exceeded my time over what we did. So, okay, if we put all of the stuff that I've talked about together, right? The tail recursion, the different approaches of, well, we didn't really implement anything with pivot selection, but the equal elements and then the insertion sort, we put all of that together. And we get something like this, right? So quicker sort is, of course, much better than this, but it goes along, and for really large arrays, we're about 90 times faster, which is great. But this is on a Sandy Bridge. On a Nehalem, we get something even better, and on a Clovertown, it's somewhere in between, right? So great. With a few tweaks on the standard implementation of quicksort, we can get significant improvements on this. Right? So I'm going to end here with a little bit of wrap up, but I want to make this point. The purpose of this exercise was, and the purpose of talking about all of it with you guys isn't so much to say that, hey, here's quicksort and here's how you can make it go better. Right? I mean, hopefully, like I said at the beginning, if tonight somebody wakes you up in the middle of the night and says, tell me quicksort, you'll say, less than n, pivot, split, recurse, right? I mean, I hope that is really ingrained in you guys. But you start thinking about all the algorithms that you develop, start thinking about all the decisions that you're making as you implement them, and start thinking about how you can do them even better, right, in a more optimal manner. Okay, so there's a lot of other stuff that we left on the table that we didn't get to at all, right? In terms of this, we actually, I've mentioned this before, so, and I must say I cheated. In the implementation, we just put in 128 and we ran with that, right? Ideally, what we want to do is, depending on the platform that we're running on, selecting the right switchover point. Depending on the type of the array, figure out whether we want to do quicksort at all or just switch over to insertion sort, right? Then I talked a little bit about this. We just did some analysis, but there's a lot of work that depends upon trying to figure out what the cost is. So, for example, if you want to take the median of medians, people have shown that that's the really optimal element to take as a pivot. But what's the cost of that, given that you're going to have cache misses and you're going to have to pull things in from main memory? So it could be that for small arrays, use a median of medians. For large arrays, use something else. And of course, it depends on the array pattern as well, right? Okay, we talked about this, and there's a very standard approach that says, okay, instead of partitioning quicksort into 2, partition it into 3. So all the equal elements equal to a pivot are in the middle, less than, greater than, or what have you. And there's a lot of analysis that we can do by just counting how many times things are swapped and how many compares we're doing. Are you guys familiar with Sedgwick's books on algorithms? Yes? No? Yes? No? Okay, a few out here, but mostly no. Go and read those books. They're fantastic. Especially from the perspective of analyzing what is happening when your algorithm runs. He does a fantastic job of gathering the data and presenting it in a really fantastic manner. Right? All right, finally, I talked about this stuff. There's a little bit of optimizations in which, in which order, which subpartition do we recurse or iterate on first. There's also this thing about, keep going down the recursion tree till you reach the point where you want to switch to insertion sort, and then maybe you should just stop out there and then do an insertion sort on the entire array. Hit all the leaves at once instead of doing insertion sort out there. So there's multiple ideas floating around there that are worth investigating. And if you guys are interested, hey, give me a call or drop me an email, and let's discuss, right? All right. The slides I have sent over, so you guys should have access to them. These are the papers that we used in a lot of these ideas came from these papers. They're not necessarily original. And this is the first one, the engineering a sort function. And I would highly recommend reading it along with this. So the notes on engineering a sort function. Try saying that 5 times quickly. So he actually asked questions. In section 3, when the author says this, what does he meaning? Can you give an example of a situation where this happens? So it really makes you think about the paper and the ideas presented out there. There's also this paper that's kind of, I don't know if it's a 1984 paper, but I really like the title itself, introspective sorting. It's very inward looking. But they actually talk a lot about some of the things that I've been saying. You can't just have one algorithm that applies to everything. You've got to look at the data that you're getting, the size, the platform that you're running on, and so on, and then make the choices that you need to do, right? And I'm going to end with the last paper, which is an extremely cool idea, and hopefully that will give you ideas of your own as well. So with Quicksort, it's always been a kind of race. People can come up with different strategies for saying, hey, if I do this, if I use median of medians, or if I do this other thing, I am going to get close to n log n performance instead of n squared. So you're always pushing towards n log n. And the other side of the contest is to say, okay, let me generate this kind of data. So when your algorithm runs on it, it actually runs in n squared because the partitions are completely skewed, right? So okay, you could keep doing that on and on, but what this guy did, and Bentley is the same guy who wrote the first paper as well, he wrote this program called anti-quicksort. So it has an array of elements, but he's not telling that to Quicksort yet. So Quicksort says, hey, give me an element and I'm going to use that as a pivot, and give me the element at index, I don't know, n plus 1 by 2 or something, right? So he says, okay, he'll generate an element, give it to it, and then anti-Quicksort will look at how elements are being used and where they are being stored, and he'll start generating values so that you end up with skewed partitions, right? So no matter what strategy you implement in Quicksort, anti-Quicksort is going to come up with the spread of values that give you n squared behavior. How cool is that, right? And that is without getting access to the source code, without understanding the algorithm, or without understanding the strategy that's being used for the Quicksort. All right. Okay, so I'm going to end out there. Thanks a lot for your time. I know I overstepped my time, and I'm sorry for the late delay. But I hope you guys had fun. I hope the content of the talk made up for the delay. And I hope this has sparked enough ideas in you guys so that you go back and start hacking away at code. Right. Thanks.
Any questions?
Yes, questions. Sorry. Okay, so either this was amazingly clear or it was completely dense. We live in a binary world.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Please accept a small memento.
Whoa. Thanks. There we go. Okay, that's mine.